Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. It's so good to have you all with us. It is Sunday, and that means that it is time for another book chat with me, Zahra from Collapse Life, and Susan from Courageous Conversations. Hi, Susan. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm in another hotel room. We're book chat traveling, and good to see you and everybody else who's going to be joining us today.
Yes, thanks everyone to all of you who are just jumping on. This is turning out to be quite a mobile event. We keep moving around, and another thing is that the time is slightly changing, just enough to be probably annoying to our loyal viewers who are coming every week. It's been changing just by about half an hour here or there, an hour here. So we apologize for that. We will try and settle into a more normal rhythm. Part of it is that, as you know, we've had daylight savings here in the United States. The UK hasn't had daylight savings yet, so we are an extra hour apart right now, but that will come back into calibration in April. And then once a month, we shift this by just 30 minutes to accommodate Susan's schedule. So anyway, all to say, apologies for the shifting times, but we're really happy that everyone's jumping in and joining us.
Shifting times is a good metaphor, isn't it, for how things are going and how quickly they're going. We're going to finish talking about the book. The Fourth Turning is here by Neil Howe. And I think it's really apt, isn't it, that one of the things that he is talking about, well, it's a prophecy, and we're all trying to make sense of it and trying to find out what's going to happen next.
Yeah. Just to say, Christine has popped on to say, "Don't worry, we can pivot." So thank you, Christine, for that flexibility, and we're really happy to have you on. And as Susan said, last week we started talking about Neil Howe's "The Fourth Turning is Here." That was an update to a book that he wrote many years ago with William Strauss about the fourth turning. And basically in it, they describe a historical pattern that occurs again and again with four stages. And the fourth turning, which is what they propose is what we're in now, is a moment of crisis. And these stages last for about 80 to 100 years or so. They're characterized by certain generational traits within that 100-year period, which we talked a little bit about last week. And as we read a little bit more into the book, I was curious by how he wrote about, I think it's in chapter 5, certain chronological stages that happen within the fourth turning. So I wanted to spend a little time talking through what he says those phases are and where we might be within that timeline, so to speak. And then Susan, I know you had some other thoughts about the generations itself, and then you've read the epilogue to the book, which we should also mention. This book, even though it is an update, it still was written a few years ago, and so it doesn't capture the exact moment that we're in, but it gives us enough framework to be able to start discussing where he left off and where we can pick up and see how this supposed framework kind of plays forward.
Yeah, and how it helps us. How does this book actually support us? And what can it tell us, not just about what's happening now, but also what might happen next? He has a few sort of options, doesn't he, which I thought were interesting, different scenarios that could play out.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, they all sort of seem to lead to a similar conclusion. And for sure, the moment that we're in now, being characterized by crisis, seems to fit. So even for those detractors who might say this is all theoretical, a lot of what he describes is certainly happening now. But
yeah, as he predicted. Just for those who weren't with us last week, he said this is that we're in the fourth turning, which he equates with winter. We're in crisis that started in 2008 with the financial collapse. And he predicts that it's going to get worse over the next few years. and won't finish till 2033. I think that's the thing that he says.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting to hear your view on a bit more of the specifics about each stage. And do join in the conversation. This isn't just the two of us. We love it when other people come in, add your viewpoint. It doesn't have to be related to the book. It could be about what's going on now. But let's start off by looking at a bit more detail about what Neil Howe has to say about the different aspects of now.
I'll just go through what he lays out as sort of the chronological stages of a turning. So he starts with the precursor phase, which actually occurs during the previous turning. So in our case, the precursor stage started during the unraveling phase. The turning before the one we're in now was characterized as the unraveling, and the precursor phase foreshadows the mood of the coming crisis. In our case, Howe says that the precursor was 9/11. It was an event that basically woke up the public, who were fairly complacent at that time, expecting endless, peaceful globalism. It kind of set people a little bit off kilter and anticipated this crisis phase that we're in now. So the next phase, the phase that begins the crisis turning, is the catalyst. And as you mentioned, he put that at 2008 with the global financial crisis. That was, in fact, the most severe global economic contraction since the Great Depression here in the United States, certainly. And so that fits with the sort of 100-year cycle, or 80 to 100-year cycle. The catalyst unleashes the crisis, and then we move into what he calls the regeneracy phase. Regeneracy he puts at around the 2016 election. And he describes it as a time when society kind of draws together, but not collectively draws together. We draw together into polarized places. So, for example, with the 2016 election, we saw the rise of Donald Trump and the MAGA movement, but on the other side, increasing support for Bernie Sanders and populism on the left versus this populism on the right. Trump rallied, in fact, not only his own base into the formation of the MAGA movement, but he rallied the left into forming a kind of resistance to this polarized populism on the other side. It basically started to become framed as fascism versus socialism, and you felt yourself being drawn or pushed into one side or another. And that phase of regeneracy can last quite a long time. And in fact, he suggests that there can be a first regeneracy and a second regeneracy, where during the second regeneracy, the poles maybe shift a little bit, but people still become pulled into their own community, so to speak. Then after the second regeneracy, we move into, hold on one second.
Just while you're looking at that, Zahra, one of the things I thought was interesting in the book, and again, timing, because it was actually published in 23, Neil Howe doesn't think Trump would get in a second time.
Yeah.
That was actually in the book, because he didn't think that he would have enough popular support.
Interesting.
Really interesting. So over to you again.
Yeah, sorry. So just two more phases. After the regeneracy, we move to the climax of the crisis, which we've already mentioned he kind of predicts will happen around 2030. And then the resolution, whether it's successful or a failure, there's going to be some resolution to the crisis. Leaders will be chosen, or will choose which side of that framework is the resolution of the crisis, whether it's success or a failure. And then all of that moves into, again, the next first turning, which is the awakening. So this is his philosophy of how this chronology will work. So he suggests that we're still in this regeneracy phase. And so I'd love to hear what others maybe have to think about that. And I know that we have some comments, so let me pop over. Christine says, anticipating a logical outcome is easier for some. Do either of you and anyone in the chat know their MBTI configuration? I'm officially peering into all your souls. And she also says the joys of a Hegelian dialectic, which absolutely. So the MBTI configuration, Christine, I think you'll have to explain for those who are watching who aren't familiar with that. I believe it's on one of these personality.
Is it Myers-Briggs?
Myers-Briggs, yeah.
Yeah.
So Christine, I think, is asking if we know our own Myers-Briggs configuration.
Ah. In what context? Why is this useful, Christine? It'd be really good to know where you're, because you always add so much.
Yeah.
Why do you want to know this?
Yeah, interesting. Good follow-up question. Yeah. So let us know. But what are your thoughts on at least those first 3 phases? So 9/11 being the time when people were kind of woken out of their slumber. Then we moved into the phase that was the catalyst for this current crisis, being the great financial crisis. And now we're in this polarized position where people can't see how the other worldview even exists. What are your thoughts, Susan? Does that fit? Do you think there's nuance missing?
No, I think it's a good summary. I mean, in terms of his predictions about this crisis stage, I mean, he does cover all bases, doesn't he? In terms of that, a lot of polarization. We've got it in the UK as well, but not as much as you have in America, from my perception. And there is a lot of uncertainty, and obviously with the war now 2 weeks in, there's even more uncertainty on the economic front. And the other thing that Howe does is he says it's going to be really bad. And one of the things we have to do is admit that we're in winter, that we're in this crisis. And I can't be anybody out there anymore who's in denial. I really, like a month or so ago, you could have sort of said, yeah, everything's going on fine, it's splendid. But you can't anymore. People are really waking up now to this whole crisis that we're in. And I think he was spot on about identifying what the symptoms of that sort of phase are.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's always easier to look over at some other situation rather than the one that you're in. But if we dial back to 2016, which is when he thinks that whole first phase of regeneracy began, we saw, as I mentioned, the sort of populist alignment, left versus right, but both kind of populist movements. We know we saw this in other European countries, but 2016 was Brexit in the UK, wasn't it? So doesn't that also fit as a moment when certain beliefs about who you were as British people started coming undone or being cracked open a little bit?
Well, thanks for reminding me of that. Yeah, that was a horrendous time. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you think about the context of the book and the things that you've listed, Zahra, we've had so many traumatic events and things happening that it's just one thing after another. And Brexit was incredibly divisive in the UK. I totally that. Amazing thing, isn't it? How we forget what we've been through. I mean, locally, you had to keep quiet about what you actually voted for because the venom was incredible. People were hysterical, the people who lost. They were absolutely beside themselves. And if they found out that you were one of the people who voted against them, they were vitriolic and really horrible. It was very unpleasant. It was very
Yeah.
nasty.
Really interesting. So you were already living outside of the metropolitan area by the time that happened. I was actually in London, or the outskirts of London, at the time that that election happened, and I found, in my experience, there was an assumption of how you voted. Didn't
Yeah.
matter whether you knew each other well or had ever discussed politics before. I didn't vote. I was not a citizen or part of that vote, but I watched really carefully all of the colleagues and acquaintances that I knew. I was very interested in this moment. And again, it's easier looking from the outside in. Um, I found that to a T, everyone that I encountered just made an assumption that you were going to vote Remain. There was no question that anyone in that milieu would ever consider to vote Leave.
Oh,
Which I just
absolutely.
think is really interesting because again, we form these echo chambers and we get very comfortable in them. And it was the same. I happened to be that same year in the UK at the time that Hillary Clinton ran against Donald Trump. And it was the same assumption. Everyone assumed that any thinking person would vote a particular way and never ever dream and this is not a place to discuss the merits of one candidate or another. I think it's really interesting how people created a bubble around themselves and made these assumptions that this is how I think, so therefore everyone that I know or who I would deem to discuss a topic with must feel the same way as me. There's a couple of comments. One, just following on to that idea, just as a reminder, it feels as though there have been more prime ministers in that 10-year period since Brexit happened than in, the decade before it. The elections and the turnover of government in the UK has been so rapid. I mean, I don't even know if you would be able to name all the prime ministers that you've had since then. There was one who lasted a couple of weeks. That's another thing that's changed.
Distrust. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. So just a point to say that sometimes these things are happening so fast around us that we actually start to forget all the things that we've been through in such a short period of time. I do want to actually bring up this really interesting comment from Dan Roach because it sort of sets the entire context for how we discuss this book on its ear a little bit. Dan says, many people now believe that the world-changing events are well-planned and executed by a millennia-old group of controlling elites. In this sense, this is actually all well-planned. Thus, in the context of this book, we non-elites are controlled to behave and think the way they want. And therefore, Dan, please correct me if I'm misconstruing what you're saying, but are you saying that a book like this that lays out these historical turnings and tells us what stage we're at is actually just almost conditioning us to accept that this planned out event was already going to happen, and this helps us situate ourselves within a very well planned out and fully executed framework? What do you think, Susan?
That's really interesting, and what Dan comes back. I think the book totally ignores that aspect, and that was one of my major disappointments in the book. So yes, he takes a historical perspective, but he doesn't seem to think that it's been manipulated to actually, or created, or demolished, or planned. There doesn't seem to be any account of that at all. So
He's a fairly mainstream thinker that way. So I would
yeah,
be very surprised if Neil Howe were to say this is the plan. And I don't think that his book would have had nearly the amount of traction because the mainstream would want you to think that's all conspiracy theory. There's no small cabal planning all of this, and there never has been. And I mean, obviously, the people who are joining this call feel differently about that.
yeah, which I can totally see, and I think it's probably it could be just a sweetener, if you like. Is well, look at this; it's all just part of history. all you people who think it's all planned, you're all conspiracy theorists, you know,
Yeah.
and you're making it up. Mind you, I did see the other day, it said, if you're not a conspiracy theorist, you're not trying hard enough.
I do love that. Yeah. But I think it's a really interesting way of actually looking at this book as potentially a part of the anesthesia of making us think, well, this always happens, you know, when really no, this doesn't always happen. And in fact, there have been huge revolutions and popular uprisings that have toppled these kinds of planned events before. But again, you know, things are happening at such a rapid pace now that we forget what happened to us 5 years ago, let alone what happened to other people 500 years ago.
But it's a major premise of the book. Sorry to cut across you. You just made me think about it. Is that the other part that he looks at the transitions and the different sort of stages, but he also looks at the generational types, the archetypes, and he gives the impression that they're the ones who shape it, not the elites or, you know, the people who shouldn't be in power. So he did a chapter which I did try to read twice, and it was so convoluted about each stage, each age, each archetype, what they would be doing at each different thing. And I just imagine he had this huge whiteboard with all these sort of cross-referenced, and it completely lost me. It was just so extreme that what would be happening, I think, for like the next 50 years with all the different archetypes and at each different stage of what would be happening. You know, it's sort of like disappearing up the proverbial in terms of, and as an academic. Yeah, you probably pick up my tone. I mean, I chose this book because I thought it would be a really good one to help us make sense of things. And to me, and it's so obvious that we do operate in cycles. Something will come after this. And I said to you when we started this that there was some criticism of the book, and one of them, he wasn't specific enough. He was just sort of general things, yeah, that spring will come and it will bring in new order. The old order will have died.
I could have written that book. It is, I think it's really interesting, actually. And thank you, Dan, for making us think this way. I think it is really interesting to think about it as a potential tool for more control, or just a balm to, you know, to try and ease the tension that people feel when they live through this kind of chaos. And even describing the generational archetypes, it almost removes a little bit of agency from us, to think that, oh, well, you know, everyone in my generation behaves this way because this is how we are, and therefore nothing's going to change. But, you know, even the so-called elites, which I hate, I try to never use that term anymore, but even those so-called controllers fall within one of those generational archetypes. And so it doesn't always, I mean, they're not heroes or nomads or anything like that necessarily. So I just want to pop back over to Christine's comment about the Myers-Briggs, because she's added a little bit more, which I don't know enough about Myers-Briggs to even know what the acronyms mean. But she says, not just NI DOMs, but intuitives in general, NE as well. She says the group cohesion based on the threat of being shamed is a powerful tool. It reminds me of the 100th Monkey article, which is an article that I had posted on Collapsed Life on Substack, where Christine said, I commented on the efficacy of the first monkey getting punished for making an unorthodox decision or conclusion. So just to quickly recap that, the 100th monkey is apparently, so in the 1950s, there were scientists studying an island, I believe in the Japanese archipelago. There was one monkey, they used to leave sweet potatoes on the beach for the monkeys. There was one monkey who discovered that you could wash the sand off the sweet potato by running it under moving water. She taught her mother and then a few of her peers, and then suddenly all the community of monkeys started washing their potatoes. And then it seemed to trigger the same behavior on another island. And so the idea is that it eventually there's sort of a tipping point where what started out as an unorthodox behavior becomes the norm and everybody starts to do it. And you could be the one that tips that scale. So that just to bring that up, that, you know, when you're the first to do something that goes against what others are doing, there's a high cost, a high social cost to be paid for that. And many people therefore choose not to step outside the norm.
Yeah, it comes up in, I think it's Rupert Sheldrake's, it's morphic resonance, isn't it? That somehow something is picked up outside our realm of consciousness. So the monkeys were picking up a new skill without actually physically being taught it. And can we extrapolate that to ourselves? Yeah, interesting.
There's a comment from Dippleview. It says, wasn't the book based on historic events over the centuries, Knights Templar et al.? It seems a bit far-fetched, and the technologies available would not have lent themselves to world control. Isn't it more about the cycle influencing how people develop? Elites would struggle to control consistently over millennia. Thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
it's a good point. It does look back on a lot of history. I mean, I read some of it, but it's very American centric, so wasn't my area of expertise. Not that I really have one, but I think that's another good point, isn't it? That you can look back over history and cherry pick what fits your model. And if I go back to Dan's point, I mentioned this last week. Apparently, the first book, just called The Fourth Turning, was one of Steve Bannon's favorite books because it was like, yes, the old systems need to go. Let's bring it on. And here's proof that this is how history works. So they were using it as, yeah, we do need a new system to come in. We need the digital currency and control, and we have the technology to do it. So yeah, it played into that.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting that it can work both ways. So the cycle that we're in can influence how people act within that time period, but also how people act can influence the overall, and now because we live in such a globalized world, the overall atmosphere, not just in one country or culture, but now all over the world. So there's sort of a push-pull that the time period that we live in influences us and our behaviors and our thinking and the technology that we develop, but also the technology and the thinking influences us cyclically.
Yeah, it's hard to differentiate, isn't it, in terms of that. What I did think was interesting is that he speculates, A, it's going to get worse, B, that it will sort of culminate in 2030 and that it will finish in 2033. And I was talking to some on our sort of page, and they didn't know much about World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab and all of that, which is the 2030 sort of timeline. And the other one I heard the other day, which again I hadn't sort of joined the dots, was all the religious fanaticism of it's 2,000 years since Jesus's ministry started and finished in 33 AD or whatever you call it now, because apparently that's changed. And so this sort of 2,000 year and creator of Greater Israel, the religious connotations of Jerusalem being the capital for the World Economic Forum, global technocracy. So, you know, was Neil Howe actually in on that by saying that this new spring, because he doesn't say it's going to be a good thing, it's just going to be a change that's going to come in 2033.
2030 also lines up with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which are the follow on to the Millennium Development Goals. So that was 2000 to 2015, the Millennium Development Goals, then 2015 to 2030. So those are just 15-year arbitrary cycles in which the world was supposed to set goals for development. Many of those SDGs fit very closely over a one world government, one world religion kind of framework as well. So you can read as you like into these things. And as you said, with Neil Howe's book, those of us who are not huge, detailed students of history can read it and go, oh, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. But he may have really cherry picked the evidence that works to support his thesis, as most authors will have done. There's a couple of comments that I want to go back to here, just to follow up what we were saying about the previous comment. Dippleview says nurture over nature would tend towards the different eras, not define them. Absolutely. So yes, thanks for that comment. And then Randolph Proksch says, greatly appreciate your willingness to give space for Dan's perhaps contrary observation to expand the focus on the author's relatively confining historical framework. You've mentioned how we can't use that framework for specific year predictions. Help me to remember history rarely repeats, but it certainly rhymes. Yeah. So thank you so much for that, Randolph. That's a great comment. So again, we chose to discuss this book because all of us here, I think, are just trying to make sense of what's happening now. We're living through absolute chaos, certainly crisis, and people want to know why and when will it end and what will come next. I mean, these are natural questions for us to ponder. And so we chose this book to see if it would help explain some of this. And it can very neatly explain it. And then you read the book, you close it, you put it back on your shelf and you go, okay, I get it now. And that's really not where we want to end. We want to keep using this to push these questions and to really take it forward, and also not accept that whatever comes next is already written. I think that's not a happy place to be. I mean, a lot of the things, we've talked about this before, a lot of the things that are happening are out of our control. There are a lot of things that we can recognize and analyze, but not control. But I also think it's a bit dangerous for us to just sit back and see ourselves as pawns being moved around a chessboard without any ability to affect change, at least in our own small environment.
Yeah, it's still up for grabs, isn't it? I mean, we do have the answer in that he's saying that a new system will be coming in 2033. And it is down to us as well about what that new system is. And we mustn't lose sight of that. I think that's really important. And I think the first thing is to admit we're in crisis and that we know that the old system is dying and collapsing, because that's what we talk about all the time. So it's not news to us, but it's the fact of actually saying, okay, what can we do about it?
For sure. And, certainly we probably all live in somewhat of an echo chamber, but in my echo chamber, it certainly feels as though there's no denying that we're in crisis mode now. And everyone I speak to will admit to some extent that something's happening. And certainly over the last 2 weeks with the world at war, there are very few people now who are pretending as though nothing has changed.
Yeah.
Pat Brown says 2033 is also, there's a computer glitch expected with one of the timekeeping methods. That is very interesting, Pat. She said her tech husband mentioned this a few years back, so not sure if it has been fixed. Ancient programmers are dying out. And then vis-a-vis elites, she says, I like Tom Hartman's term, morbidly rich. Yeah, because I said I don't like that word elite. So she's offering a great alternative, morbidly rich.
Yeah, I heard one tonight, which was very complimentary at all. It said, how can 100, I won't repeat what it said, control 800 people, control 8 billion. It's just phenomenal, isn't it? It is phenomenal what's actually going on. Yeah. And, this is part of why we're here is, just to talk about that. And it's interesting that Christine mentioned last week about being in the Kali Yuga, which is again about prophecies about end times and difficult times. And I did look that up because I was familiar with some of it, but not the sort of detail. Now, some people think we're still in it, and some people think that we've come out of it, and or we're in that sort of middle period. But there's lots of prophecies that have been made about this time by people a long time before 2023, when this book came out. So that's interesting as well. And that's how he finished the book, which I thought was fascinating. I don't know if anybody got round to reading the last chapter, but
You might be the only one.
might be the only one, yeah, who actually got there. Yeah, it's quite a hefty book. But he talks about the Navajo shamans who have a ritual where they draw in the sand, like the mandalas, the sand pictures. And the idea is that they represent the past and they leave the fourth quadrant empty, which is for the future. So there's a sort of ritualistic aspect as part of their lifestyle, really, in terms of taking account of both the past and the future. And Howe's argument is that we don't view our lives like that. We're very linear. We're always moving forward. We're not looking at what the past can teach us. We're not interested in the sort of historic our predecessors who were, I was thinking about my own parents, born in the Depression, going through a world war, and they had times of crisis. These are not unusual, and yes, maybe they do come at different stages, and what follows a crisis is a period of stability and more conformity, as he says. So go on, you're going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think that the idea that things move in a linear fashion and that one thing happens and then it ends and then another one begins, that's a very Western outlook. And so it's very interesting to be living through these times and analyzing these times from that perspective, because there's a whole world of thought out there in other cultures where they don't have things as hard and fast as we see them from our Western perspective. Things are black or white, it's yes or no, it's today or yesterday. There's no in between for us, the way we look at the world. And it's something that my husband and I have been discussing, because in the course of our past lives and our careers, we had the chance to live and work in Iran. And so, of course, this is something that we're thinking about very much right now. And just thinking about some of the things that we learned during the year there, in terms of how they interact with each other, how they interact with others, the certain expectations of behavior that are all based around a very intricate form of etiquette that is exclusive to the Persian culture. Things are not black or white. There's an enormous amount of gray that exists. And you know this when you're in part of that culture. When someone says yes, but they really mean no, what that means. You read subtext, you read far below the surface layer. And everybody operates in that space. And to us, it's very foreign and confusing. But I don't think that the whole world feels that way. But because we've globalized our outlook, we think that everybody thinks the same way and operates the same way. So anyway, I've gone long on one idea, but just something I think that's worth considering.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the Chinese would take a very different perspective.
Exactly.
I can't remember who it was, but somebody was asked what did they think of the French Revolution, and they said something like, "I'll let you know when it's finished," or something.
Interesting. See, yeah.
I mean, there is something about taking an arc, a higher view of what's happening, not getting caught in the nitty-gritty, but actually seeing it as patterns of control and dominance, because it is all about that, isn't it? At the end of the day,
Let me jump back to our community for a second. Sorry, Susan,
No.
to interrupt you, but I wanted to welcome Alberta Betsy, who joined a few minutes ago and said she came in late, so she started the live at the beginning, but she just wanted to say hello and God bless. Thank you for this book chat. I enjoy them. So we enjoy having you. Thanks, Betsy, and chime in when you're ready and have thoughts. Christine also says they use chaos to begin the change, but in the chaos, we have an opportunity to define the new terms as well, which just going back to our point about how we have more control than we sometimes give ourselves credit for. And a book like this may actually make us feel more passive than active. So I think that's a great point. And then
in some ways, yeah. Go on. Sorry, more comments. Keep them coming.
Just one more. Let me read it before we get too lost. Dipple View regarding 2030 as a particular year. 2030 is also key in the Club of Rome projections from 1972. These are about resource usage rather than societal influences, the culmination of events, resource use patterns, empirical versus subjective. Plus, you've got the inevitable end to empires, even Rome. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead, Susan. You were
well. I was just going to say, if you know that change is a dramatic change is going to happen because you've come to the end of the cycle, that there's a next transition coming in, and you've even got the date, then you can start to plan for it. And that's his argument in the book, that if you accept that it's winter, and I think he writes, he says, you should act knowing that it's winter, that we're in crisis. You should help communities prepare for spring. So what do we need to have in place for the next stage? Not just to get bogged down in all the things that are going wrong, but this is what we see with alternative people who are growing. I mean, just in this last week, how many emails have people had about saving food or growing food or any of those things? People are sort of in a way preparing for the spring. It's really interesting.
I wonder if, so I think in our modern, especially Western view, we've come to fear death and really try to find ways to extend our life, to extend that healthy portion of our life anyway, to beat death and achieve immortality. This has become, for many people, not myself or maybe many of the people on this call, but for a large part of our culture, this fear of things coming to an end may contribute a little bit to this idea too, that like the American empire will at some point come to an end. The way of life that we have all benefited from will come to an end. We don't like those massive changes. We don't like to see things that we've certainly enjoyed coming to an end. And I wonder if that's just a sort of modern man's view of things as well. And again, talking about different cultures and more ancient cultures, when you lived closer to the land and you accepted that life was a cycle, and that our time on this earth ends, and that there will be another phase, whatever that might be, that comes after, there might have been less tension.
Yeah, I think if you go back to what he quotes after the Second World War, which was spring, and there was optimism and huge building projects and economic expansion, wages became better, all of that sort of side of things, then you can see why he wants people to think about how they can make most of spring coming in and be prepared for it. And our ancestors would know that. They would be, as you say, more in touch with the seasons. They would already be thinking about it. And I think the difference is that where people were optimistic in that previous spring, thinking that it would be better, that their children would have better lives, I think we're at a point now as a society, globally probably, is thinking that it will be worse. That we can't expect things to be better for our children because we already know that they're more difficult. So that optimism has gone, and I don't think that'll come back. I can't see it coming back in the spring, this next spring that he talks about.
Yeah. Again, interesting to think about that as a Western perspective, that, we have lived through times where our parents and our grandparents, every single turn, every single new season, things got better. There were improvements. And that isn't necessarily how people in sub-Saharan Africa have felt over the last 50 years, or, everybody's situation is going to be different. So I'm not, I don't know what it's like to live in another culture or see the world through another set of eyes, but I do wonder how much of what we're thinking and feeling is tied to who we are and where we were born. And for a lot of people, the end of this hegemony will be seen as a good thing, not a bad thing.
Yeah, and aren't we privileged to be sitting in our comfortable spots discussing this when the majority of the world's just caring about surviving? It's a real privilege to have this discussion. But I think we're having it because we know that that's the probability of what's around the corner for us.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
And at least seeing things realistically, gives you that solid ground to stand on, to say, this is what's happening. Let's not pretend it's not happening. That's not going to do anyone any good. And it's the ugly truth, so to speak. But yeah. I just want to bring in, and I just, first of all, just want to say thank you to everybody who joins us on these Sunday chats. It's just been such a great experience to see this group grow, and some regulars who come back every week. So we're really, really pleased. Pat, who is one of our regulars, says, I find it interesting folks mostly can only see the next step in cycles, but not the full circle. So of course, there's a ton of pessimism because we've lost our connection to the land, which is a really good point, because when we not that long ago lived more agrarian lifestyles, every single turning in the season that happened every few months, we knew it intimately. We relied on it for our survival. And so when things happened or didn't happen on a regular cycle or succession, our survival and our well-being kind of depended on that. And we knew it intimately. We knew when the moon was going to turn, and what that meant in terms of what should be planted and what should be harvested. And this was not that long ago. It always boggles my mind when you think about agriculture, how quickly we've lost that body of knowledge just within a couple of generations.
Yeah, that's true, isn't it? It's and some cultures are much nearer to that. They're only a generation away from being on the land, whereas certainly in the UK, we're quite a few generations away from that, and that's not really a possibility for people.
Yeah. Christine says the old terms, the status quo, was unsustainable. The transition to the new paradigm will be profoundly difficult, a crucible, if you will.
Yeah, it will be. And you wonder how, will it just come in seamlessly, or will it be like a cultural shock in some way? I think this is the other thing that we don't know. This, it's really existential now, isn't it? With threats and World War III and all of that. The ante has really increased, as has the anxiety.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting that he ends the book much more from a philosophical point of view.
Yeah.
I said I'd mentioned this, and I mentioned about the Kali Yuga, and Kali, she's the goddess of destruction, but she's also the goddess of regeneration. So you can't have regeneration without destruction. You can't have a new growing season without having finished the previous season and tilled the land and made it right. This is the nature and the cycle of life. And he goes on to talk about Dharma, which I thought was really interesting, because one of the other things that really put me off the book, and I mentioned it when we were talking before, is he thinks that America should be building up its military in preparation for this crisis time.
That seems like an evidence point that goes right back to Dan's theory that this book was all part of helping us understand what was already planned.
Yeah, Quite possibly. Yeah. I'm sure there are insiders who think, who get promoted or their books get attention because they're saying the right thing. It follows the script. It keeps the peasants happy. They think that this is just seasonal and that we'll come out of it at some stage and life will go back to normal and everything will be all right. And it just keeps us quiet for a bit longer. I'm wondering about that. That's the sort of, because he ends talking about the Bhagavad Gita and the battle when which everybody brings in, don't they? Arjuna doesn't want to fight the battle, and Krishna tells him that it's his duty, it's his dharma, and even though it's his family and people he knows, that he's still got to go in and kill them.
Wow.
And
that's
you knew the story.
I just find it surprising that I didn't read that part of the book. I find it surprising that that's where he brings things to a culmination. Okay.
Yeah, I know. It's really weird that you write a book like that and you have all these historic examples and then you have an epilogue in which you then talk about Dharma and that everybody has their Dharma to fulfill. And then he writes something which I thought was really expressive, is Dharma is connected to the order of history and to the order of the cosmos in ways that exceed human expectations. So again, he's just leaving it up to chance. That's why I thought he hasn't acknowledged the planning and the preparation and the manipulation of history in any way, shape or form.
Correct. Dipple View says, remember limits to growth, which was a report put out by the Club of Rome.
Yeah.
The next turn will be into a resource depleted future. The next turn will be very different, digging for victory rather than shopping till you drop. Yeah, absolutely. I know that there are a few other comments and I will get to them in just 1 second. But before we move on from that idea that we will be moving into a resource depleted future, whether that is by chance or by planning, I think that leads us into just maybe quickly mentioning, Susan, what we're going to talk about next week, which is the idea that the crisis that we're in right now is going to be affecting very quickly our food supply. And so maybe you just want to talk for a second about how we're going to frame next week's discussion.
Yeah, because we thought it was very timely. There's a lot of talk about oil and how that's going to affect everybody. But I think it's the food that's really going to affect us more, because we can stop driving, but we can't stop eating. And I read a book a little while ago, which I thought was an excellent book, called Fiat Food by Mark Lysak. And we'll put all this in the details. We do send a little sort of written up summary of these talks, and to talk about food, because he really talks about how the food market was manipulated for money. No surprises there, but he does go into detail. And where that connects for me is one of the things is a shortage of fertilizer that's going to affect the soy and corn crops. And soy and corn weren't natural things that Americans were eating and the British weren't eating. But their whole diet was manipulated to eat more of this. And now that's going to be in short supply because we can't get the fertilizers. So we thought, what a relevant topic. Let's talk food next week.
Yeah. So I hope all of you will be able to join us next week. For those who are watching us on video platforms like YouTube and Rumble and BitChute, Susan just mentioned that we send out a recap, written recap of these chats. And so we encourage you to head over to Substack and subscribe to Courageous Conversations and also to Collapse Life, so that you are on the list to be able to receive those. And also, quite frankly, everything else that we put out. Susan is very good at sharing very interesting poetry. In Collapse Life, we write about news and culture and geopolitics and all sorts of things. So anyone who's not already subscribed, we do encourage you to do so. Christine over on YouTube says, great topic for the next round. But she also had a few other comments that I haven't had a chance to get to. She mentioned the Cassandra complex, to be burdened with knowing the truth, but to never be believed. The Greeks understood the human psyche. And then she says after that, the buildup of a massive, ineffective military is a hallmark of a dying empire, not a healthy one. That's a really interesting point, and it ties very much to what you just said about what Neil Howe said in his book, that sort of surprising given when he was writing, but maybe not surprising given what Dan Roach had pointed out. Which yeah, it's been great. So thank you everyone for all these comments, and keep them coming. We're coming close to the top of the hour, but we won't shut down the chat unless everybody has had a chance to say what they were thinking. So I just wanted to say, just going back to the book for a second, that Howe places us in this phase of regeneracy. What he says comes next is a phase of consolidation. So he says that this is where there will be a decisive event, the fight that decides everything. And he suggested, even when he wrote this book, that has probably not happened yet. When it does happen, the pace of events will accelerate dramatically. That moment of consolidation will generally surprise everyone, he says. So that, according to Neil Howe, is what we have to look forward to as the next phase.
On a sort of positive thing, one of the things I wrote down, because I said about the different archetypes, which you reeled off last week very impressively, Zahra, about when people were born. And I can't quite remember that, but the 4 categories are hero, artist, prophet, and nomad. Mm-hmm. And he says that there will be endowments that we bring as each archetype. So heroes, and they will contribute to this next sort of phase, community, affluence, and technology. So I thought that was interesting, because I think that's the age of a lot of the tech bros. Mm-hmm. The next one is artists, who will bring letters, expertise, and due process. And then the prophet, which I am, it's not a prophet, but in that baby boomer bracket, is values, vision, and religion. And nomads will bring the ability to survive, honor, and liberty. I think it's the nomads he thinks that will be most influential in the next transition.
So the nomads, I believe, are the Gen X generation, born between the mid 1960s and the mid 1970s. That's the generation in which I was born. And I would say that a lot of the sort of Silicon Valley tech bros right now belong in that generation, right. The nomad generation. Yeah, Christine says MBTI and the Greek pantheon, speaking of archetypes. So we're going to have to look a little bit more into Myers-Briggs, so that we can pull out some of those insights that Christine is suggesting. Yeah, well, I think we've done Mr. Howe due process. Interesting ideas. We can take from it the idea that everything has happened before. Nothing is new under the sun. But also, I mean, it does, a lot of it does fit in terms of what we're seeing right now. But I think it's also just really important to remember that it's not all been written. We are able to direct our own future, and collectively we can direct an even larger portion of the future. So I think that's really important. And I think that this weekly chat is contributing to that. So thanks everyone for joining us and for sharing all your thoughts, and just for being eyes open, even when what we're staring at can be pretty bleak and disordered. It's really important that we keep our eyes open and don't look away. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Susan, for joining in. Christine says, as a parting comment, the monkey who changed the group behavior was a low-ranking individual. Change is often forced from the fringe. I think that's a great place to end.
Yeah, I see the Margaret Mead's thing is never doubt the power of a small group or of a small thing. Just think of a mosquito. Yeah, things can change, and we must bear that in mind and keep our spirits up, that everything is still in play. Nothing is certain at this stage, just the continual flow of life, isn't it? So great. Nice to see you, Zahra. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. Love these chats. So informative and great to hear from people. Thank you.
Yes,
See you next
absolutely.
week for the new
Thank
book.
you, everybody. Yes. And Randolph said, thank you for another fascinating, helpful discussion. Great selection for next week's topic. So we look forward to seeing all of you again next week for that discussion. Thanks, Susan. Be well. Everybody have a great week.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.